NATO seems to be adopting a strategically fascinating policy, but no one is really talking about it. Today we will. For background, NATO has a problem. I know it, you know it, they know it. It is free riding, the act of not paying your fair share, but still enjoying the costly efforts of everyone else. It has been a problem since the dawn of the alliance. It got worse when the Cold War ended and the Soviet threat dissipated. It caused even greater frustration in the United States just after the turn of the millennium, when its own spending went up, but Europe's continued to decline. It did not get any better even as NATO set some official guidelines on what constituted a fair share of defense spending. And members only recently began taking those obligations seriously, but only after a major ground war in Europe began, thereby necessitating the guidelines to increase substantially and making that original amount insufficient. Indeed, when the Allies met at The Hague in June, they collectively agreed to spend 5% of GDP on defense. That is what the war planners calculate is necessary to fund their strategy, to not only defend Europe from a Russian invasion, but also to deter it in the first place. That said, a plan in theory is not as valuable as a plan that will work in practice. Indeed, the free-riding incentive threatened to derail the plan even before it got off the ground, and it will remain an issue for years to come as the alliance tries to implement it. But NATO thinks that it has a system in place that will solve its enforcement problem. So, today, let's explore the various different ways that NATO will try to get countries to follow through on its most ambitious spending plan ever. We will begin with the weakest point here: pure political persuasion. It is a useful tool on the edges, but persuasion alone will not be enough. Then we will go through the core strategic problem of free riding, so we can start thinking about strategic solutions. That will take us to something called the hockey stick problem, and how NATO plans to handle the timing of the enforcement mechanisms. Afterward, we will get to the two main enforcement strategies, which are sanctions, and something that I am calling not just strategic ambiguity, but ambiguous strategic ambiguity. And that last one is where the real intrigue is, because I have a fascinating quote from Secretary General Mark Rutte that I have not seen discussed anywhere else. But let's start with the Persuasion Campaign, which is notable because it is not occupying the alliance's main focus. Now, to be clear, you will still hear elements of this. Rutte, in particular, likes to tell interviewers that Russia produces 3 times as much ammunition in 3 months as the whole of NATO is doing in a year. Then there was a much-discussed quip from this speech in London. Countries leaning toward not raising their spending ought to prepare to learn to speak Russian. Headline grabbing, yes, but probably not moving the needle in entrenched camps. The upshot here is that the pure persuasion campaign is occupying much less time than is normally the case for contentious policies. Focusing exclusively on that would be a huge mistake, because just about everyone who cares to know about the situation has already made up their mind. At this level, policy disagreements are not the result of voters having missing information or outright believing misinformation. Military spending is expensive and therefore comes with trade-offs. Some voters just do not want to make those trade-offs, full stop. But I know that you as a viewer of this channel tend to be part of the remaining few, still looking to learn new information, update your beliefs, and maybe change your mind. And I have just the tool that can help you better that cause. It is the blind spot feature from our returning sponsor of today's video, Ground News. The blind spot shows you which news stories are not reaching segments of the political spectrum. For example, if you tend to read left-leaning outlets, you can filter here and see which stories you might have missed. Or you can go over to here and filter by international stories. What's this? NATO to coordinate regular and large-scale arms deliveries to Ukraine? Most will be bought from the US? Well, by going to ground.news/lines on maps, or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take an excellent 40% off their Vantage plan, which gives you access to the blind spot feature and a whole lot more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Now we can get to the core strategic issue and the various solutions to it. The free rider problem is not just that everyone else spending makes me not want to contribute. It is that any contribution that I make benefits the collective. Despite that, I only internalize a portion of those benefits, yet I pay all of the costs. If those costs are larger than my portion of the benefits, I ought not to produce the benefits at all, thus sinking the enterprise for everyone. If everyone thinks like that, though, then suddenly your alliance has gone up in flames. Perhaps you can now see why persuasion only goes so far. Free riding operates in a world where everyone perfectly understands the incentives in front of them. If everyone else is spending ample money to protect the continent, why would I bother to do the same when I am protected either way? You cannot persuade someone against that point, because that is what a well-informed person would conclude about free riding. You therefore need to focus on alternative incentives. Now, fortunately for NATO, the problem is not that extreme. Countries still spend money for their own military purposes, aside from NATO's collective goals. We have also discussed plenty about strategic complementarities, where one partner building a weapons platform makes it more attractive for a second partner to build a completely different platform. And we have also discussed how, given Russia's overarching goal of creating divisions in NATO, specifically targeting a country not meeting its spending commitments would be a good strategy for the Kremlin. That, in turn, discourages countries from being one of the few stragglers. It also puts NATO in a situation where it is critical to keep compliance rates high. If 18 countries are not complying, then the 19th sees some safety in numbers if it joins the club. It does not stick out as the obvious Russian target. And with the 5% plan in particular, permitting 1.5 percentage points to be used on infrastructure is a great way to co-opt legislators who specifically want that part done, regardless of the core military spending part. That said, those mechanisms can only take you so far. Even with complementarities and one's own personal defense needs, there remains an under-provision of military spending, which puts each country in a worse position than if they all collectively counterfactually produced what they were supposed to. It is a large-scale prisoner's dilemma, if you are familiar with that. The traditional solution to this problem, when the individual countries interact repeatedly, is to adopt cooperation contingent strategies. So, for example, Italy contributes as long as Spain contributes. But if Spain stops, then so too does Italy. It is tit for tat. Spain wants Italy to keep spending, of course, and so Italy's threat to revert back to the selfish thing keeps Spain cooperative. Sometimes you need tough love for the betterment of the whole. The good news for NATO is that usually you want to institutionalize the interaction and create explicit rules to govern it. Well, they took care of most of that part way back in 1949. The problem here is that such solutions tend to work best when the cooperation is among a small number of parties. But NATO is no longer small. If the other 30 NATO countries use the same decision rule as Italy, you would start by having 31 countries producing their proper military allotments. It would be silly if Spain, as the sole non-contributor, caused all of that cooperation to evaporate. And you cannot kick out Spain either. There is no mechanism by which to do so. It is a byproduct of NATO's original members wanting to show complete unity in their battle against the Soviet Union. The alliance today has inherited that legacy, and therefore must get creative to work around it. But they do have some ideas there. The first part of this is a resolution to the hockey stick problem. And in case you were wondering, that is actually what it is called.
So to prevent, to the Canadians and the Dutch here, ice hockey and field hockey, to prevent a hockey stick at the end of the period when you have to reach the target.
Silly naming convention or not, this is the part of the enforcement regime that the Alliance prefers to focus on, for a reason that will become obvious in a moment. The hockey stick problem is actually a lesson from the Wales Pledge experiment. The Allies agreed at the 2014 summit to raise defense spending to 2% of GDP within 10 years. Within 10 years did some heavy lifting there. What happened in practice was a tendency for states to not do anything at all for the first 8 years afterward. Then there was a sudden upswing. Ah, Mr. Lukashenko, if I could borrow you for a moment. Wait, no, I actually need Bizarro Lukashenko. There. X-axis year, Y-axis military spending. No change, sudden upswing. Looks like a hockey stick. This, by itself, even if there is technical compliance by the end, is a problem. Foregone spending in 2015 means that the Allies were not stockpiling artillery that would be useful in a later year. In other words, Allies care about the integral just as much as they care about the spending of the current year. But it is also a problem for the enforcement scheme more generally. If a country can get away with not contributing to the public good for a full decade, then it might want to free ride all the way through and not bother with the last-minute recovery. Even if there is a long-run downside to doing so, that is a problem for the next generation of leaders, not our own. In fact, NATO might not have even seen the uptick at all if not for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is reasonable to think that the Allies met the Wales Pledge by accident, rather than by intent. In contrast, the Hague Agreement is segmented for yearly increases and yearly progress reports. So if a country is not hitting its mark, then Mark will know. There will also be a more thorough audit in 4 years, which perhaps not coincidentally is after the next US presidential election. You can understand why this is the focus of NATO's public discussion of enforcement. NATO is supposed to be a family of countries. They literally call this the family photo. But maintaining order within the alliance requires some degree of a heavy hand, which has been around for a while, though it has recently gotten heavier. This part does not sound as pleasant to the casual observer, so they tend not to talk about it as much. However, catching free riders is only half of the battle. You still need to threaten some type of punishment to get compliance in the first place. So, with apologies to our model hockey player, we need to move on. There seem to be 2 primary punishment mechanisms. I will start with the more straightforward one, economic sanctions. I realize that in today's political climate, this sounds like a hammer in search of a nail. But let me explain the logic. Remember, the central enforcement conundrum inside of large organizations is that you cannot play tit for tat on the dimension you wish to encourage cooperation. So you do not punish Spain's lack of military spending by having all other countries stop spending as well. Instead, what you need to do is link into the relationship something else entirely that individually targets the free riders. Well, it did not take Donald Trump long to figure out how this might work. After all, it involves his favorite word, tariffs. A country not hitting the spending goal could be hit with, say, a 25% import tariff. This is a basic tool of both political and economic coercion. It is how sanctions work on a whole bunch of other issue areas. We are just applying it to NATO politics now. And there is a reasonable economic justification for it. Higher defense burdens require higher taxes to pay for everything. So a country that is complying with the spending target puts its businesses at a competitive disadvantage on the world market because of the higher taxation. In turn, tariffs level the playing field, shielding domestic industries from the less constrained foreign competition of free-riding countries. Obviously, that will come at a cost to the sanctioning state, but perhaps that is the price to pay to keep the overall regime compliant. However, implementing this solution gets complicated in practice. Most NATO members are also in the European Union, which, at its core, is a trade bloc. So if the United States tried sanctioning just Spain, the whole of the European Union ought to implement countermeasures. Suddenly, the world's largest trade agreement explodes. Then again, there is a conflict of interest there, because the other NATO/EU states have a vested interest in getting Spain, or whichever potential free rider is out there, to spend properly. So you could imagine some foot dragging in terms of the European Union formulating a response there. It goes without saying that the word tariff is toxic right now. But the reason it is toxic is because the current US policy breaks almost every rule economists have learned over the last 3/4 of a century. It is not because sanctions in the form of tariffs are inherently a bad coercive policy tool. Goodness knows that Europe is often in the same sanctions coalition as the United States, because they usually share common foes. Compliant European states may therefore applaud US efforts, even if they cannot contribute to the sanctions themselves because of EU limitations. Then again, there are other non-US, non-EU countries that could also join in. At the end of the day, though, this means that European Union countries will not have the same sort of tariff leverage over Spain. France or Germany cannot create a trade barrier with Spain without throwing the entire European Union into disarray. Nonetheless, Spain being in the European Union gives the organization some economic leverage in terms of how its various arms factor Spain's preferences into all sorts of other policies, both on the continent and abroad. You could imagine that, until Spain hits the spending targets, it gets iced out of those. But there is a second punishment mechanism that is not receiving as much attention as it should: strategic ambiguity, or, as I am calling it, ambiguous strategic ambiguity. Let me play a clip from the summit.
But I think allies who will not live up to this commitment can first get a very nice phone call from me, but then in a second instance, it could be that somebody from the White House who is a little bit less patient might start to pick up the phone.
That clip came from a private event that I attended while at The Hague, but many other NATO officials have said similar things. This is very interesting, and yet I have heard no analysis of it. Part of what makes this interesting is that there is no real punishment there, just an implication. Do not meet the target, and the US president will have something to say, but what exactly will be said is left ambiguous. Still, I know the first thought that you will have. You have been ripping us off for years. Well, no more. You are on your own. Remember, though, that the time period where this will really start to bite is in 2029. So, again, there will be a presidential election between now and then. And the range of opinions about NATO vary among plausible next presidents. However, Trump is not the only president who has been exasperated by Europe's low defense spending. It is basically a constant across administrations. It is fully possible that whoever picks up the phone in 2029 or 2033 will be equally exasperated, even among potential candidates with more favorable dispositions to NATO. Trump's rhetoric on this received a ton of criticism over the last decade, but that ambiguous threat is now apparently a part of the enforcement policy. This is not the first time that the United States would use strategic ambiguity to navigate through sticky alliance politics. In fact, its best-known application is with Taiwan, where the United States has no official alliance commitments. It is how Washington balances wanting to keep the Chinese Communist Party off of the island, while not giving Taipei the confidence that it can declare independence. The balancing act in Europe is wanting to preserve high levels of military spending, while still keeping Russia from conducting an operation. The possibility of abandonment encourages a free rider to get back on track, It also serves as a warning to countries currently in compliance to stay that way. But it is not a wholesale abandonment that gives an implicit green light to Russia. Even a 50-50 chance of a NATO response may still be enough to deter the Kremlin. Now, I am not even sure that strategic ambiguity is the right phrase for this, because all we really have to go on is the possibility of a not-so-friendly phone call. And the prospect of a US president saying, "Shame on you," will not do much to compel deeper military spending. In the absence of deeper and non-credible threats, like trying to remove a country from the alliance, the more creative solution of the United States looking at Article 5 and pointing out that wishing thoughts and prayers could count as the action it deems necessary to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area is the better coercive measure. But that is still not a declared policy. Instead, it is the natural speculation that follows from how transatlantic relations have worked for the last decade. It is not a decades-long policy like strategic ambiguity with Taiwan. Hence, a more fitting descriptor, at least for now, is ambiguous strategic ambiguity. What is not ambiguous is Ground News' support of this channel. They are great on that front. You can show them some love by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen. And if you enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.